Book 2, 49 B.C. The Siege of Marseille. During the Spanish campaign, my deputy commander, Gaius Trebonius, had been left behind to conduct the Siege of Marseille. He began by building earthworks, with sheds and siege towers on two sides of the town, one near the harbour and the docks, and the other near the gate leading to Gaul and Spain, close to the point where the Rhone flows into the sea. Marseille is practically surrounded by sea on three sides, and only the fourth side is accessible by land. And even on this side, the part below the citadel is naturally easy to defend, as it is cut off by a deep valley. Siege operations, therefore, must be long and difficult. For carrying them out, Trebonius ordered large quantities of hurdles and of timber to be brought in to him, and engaged great numbers of men and baggage animals from all over the province. He used the material and the labour to build up an earthwork 80 feet high. However, there had long been in Marseille enormous stocks of armaments, and in particular such powerful artillery that no sheds made of hurdles could possibly stand up to it. Great catapults fired 12-foot-long poles, pointed with iron, which went through 4 layers of hurdles before burying themselves in the ground. So the roofs of our sheds were constructed of beams, a foot thick and clamped together, and under this covering the building material was passed along from hand to hand. In front went a movable shed 60 feet long for the levelling of the ground. It was built also of very stout timber and covered with every sort of material that could be used to protect it from firebrands and stones hurled by the enemy. However, the great scale of our works, the height of their wall and the towers, together with the great number of their catapults, made our progress slow. There were also a number of sorties made by the Albicci, with the aim of setting fire to our siege works and towers. These were all easily repelled by our troops, who indeed inflicted very heavy casualties on the attackers before driving them back into the town. Meanwhile, Lucius Nasidius had been sent out by Pompey with a fleet of 16 ships, some of which had bronze beaks, to reinforce Lucius Domitius at Marseille. He sailed through the Sicilian straits without Curio having the least idea of his presence, and put into Messina. Here his sudden arrival caused a panic, and after the town council and leading citizens had taken to flight, he removed a ship from the dockyards, and, adding this vessel to his own force, sailed on to Marseille. He sent one of his smaller ships on ahead to inform Domitius and the Massilians of his arrival, and to urge them strongly, now that they were reinforced, to join battle again with Brutus's fleet. Since their last defeat at sea, the Massilians had brought out of their dockyards and repaired the same number of old ships as those which they had lost. They took a lot of trouble in equipping these ships, and had already a good supply of oarsmen and pilots to serve on them. They also made ready for service a number of fishing boats, which they decked so as to protect the oarsmen from enemy missiles, and then put archers and catapults aboard. And so, when the fleet was ready, the men embarked with their spirits roused to action by the tears and supplications of the old men, the mothers, and the young girls, who begged them to save the state in this moment of extreme peril. Thus they went out with the same spirit and the same confidence as on the occasion of the previous battle. For indeed it is one of the defects of human nature itself that in conditions which are unknown or unfamiliar, we tend to be either too sure or too unsure of ourselves. So it happened then. The mere fact of the arrival of Nasidius had filled the people of Marseille with the most extreme hopes and the most extreme enthusiasm. The wind was right for them, and they sailed out of harbour and joined him at Narrois, one of their fortified posts, where they got their ships ready for action, once more encouraged each other in view of the battle that was to come, and discussed the tactics to be pursued. The Massilians were to be on the right wing, and Nasidius on the left. Brutus also made for Taurois. His fleet had been increased. In addition to the ships which I had had built for him at Arles, he had 6 ships captured from the Marsilians, which in the last few days had been repaired and refitted. So he sailed out against the enemy in good heart and in full confidence. He encouraged his men by telling them that they could afford to consider their opponents as beaten men, since, in fact, they had already been defeated when they were at full strength. From Trebonius's camp and all the high ground around, it was easy to look down into the city and see how all the young men who had stayed behind and all the elder men with their wives and children were standing on the walls or watchtowers with their hands outstretched to heaven, or were thronging into the temples of the immortal gods and falling down before the statues as they prayed for victory. Every single one of them was convinced that on the event of this one day hung the whole future of his life and fortune. Youths of the best families and important citizens of every age had gone aboard the ships. They had been called individually for the service and had answered the summons, making it clear that if they were to fail, they had put their last supreme effort into the attempt, and if they were victorious, they could be confident about their city's future, and rely on their own internal strength as well as upon foreign help. So the 2 fleets went into action. The Marsilians showed no lack of courage. They remembered what they had just been told by their friends and their relations, and they fought as though this were really their last chance to show what they could do, as though, in facing the dangers of battle, they were standing for a moment in front of the rest of their fellow citizens who would have to suffer the same fortune of war if their city were taken. Our ships got gradually farther apart from one another, thus giving the enemy an opportunity to exploit their superior speed and the skill of their pilots. Whenever our men got the chance of holding an enemy vessel with their grappling irons, others came up from all directions to help the one that was in difficulty. The Albecians, who were fighting on the enemy side, showed no reluctance to engage our men at close quarters, and fell little short of them in soldierly qualities, and at the same time missiles were constantly being discharged from the smaller vessels, causing a number of casualties among our men, who had enough on their hands already when suddenly exposed to this unexpected form of attack. Brutus's flagship was easily recognizable by its ensign, and seeing it, 2 enemy triremes bore down on him from opposite directions. Brutus, however, realized the danger, and making full use of all the speed he had, managed to slip between them just in time. Driving on at full speed, the triremes collided. Both were badly damaged, and one of them, with its beak broken off, was put out of action altogether. This was observed by those ships of Brutus's fleet which were nearby, and they set on the disabled ships at once, and soon sank both of them. Narcidius's ships put up no sort of a fight, and quickly withdrew from the battle. Their crews were not fighting in sight of their own country, and were impelled by no entreaties of their own dear ones to put their lives into jeopardy. So from this squadron not a single vessel was lost. Of the Marsilian craft, 5 were sunk, 4 captured, and 1 joined the fleet of Narcidius, which made off for the east coast of Spain. Of the rest, 1 was sent ahead to Marseille to bring the news. As it drew near, the whole population poured out to hear the result of the battle, and when they heard it, were so utterly prostrated with grief that one might have imagined that the city had fallen then and there. Nevertheless, they showed just as much resolution as before in preparing everything possible for its defence. The soldiers who were working on the right of our lines came to the conclusion that it would be a great help to them against constant enemy attacks if they were to build a brickwork shelter, or stronghold, close under the wall. So they constructed one which was, at first, quite small, with low walls, to be used simply against sudden sorties. Here they used to retire, and from here fight back if outnumbered. From here, too, they would charge out to push back or to pursue the enemy. The fortification was a square, each side of which was 29 feet long. The walls were 5 feet thick. Later, we learn everything from experience. They began to use their ingenuity, and to see that this building would be much more useful if it were raised to the height of a tower. They proceeded to do so in the following way. When they had built the walls up to the level of the first story, they laid the floor in such a way that the ends of the joists were hidden by the outer surface of the walls, so that there should be nothing projecting and vulnerable to the enemy's fire missiles. On top of this wooden structure, they built walls of small bricks up to the height at which the workers were still protected by the sheds and screens. Across these brick walls they laid a pair of joists not quite long enough to reach the outer walls. These were intended to be supports for the wooden framework, which in the end would be the roof of the tower. On top of these joists, and at right angles to them, other joists were laid and fastened with tie-beams. These joists were longer than the others, and projected beyond the outside walls, so that screens could be hung from them to protect men building the outer walls up from below. The top of the platform, resting on the joists, was covered with a layer of bricks and mortar to preserve it from fire. Above this they spread out mattresses to prevent javelins or artillery missiles from piercing the woodwork or crashing through the brick. Matting, made out of ship's cables, 4 feet high, and covering the 3 sides of the tower exposed to the enemy, was hung from the joists that projected from the walls. Past experience had taught them that this was the only kind of protection absolutely to be relied upon against artillery. When the finished part of the tower was thoroughly shielded and protected from every kind of enemy missile, the sheds were removed for use somewhere else, and the roof of the tower was hoisted up by leverage from the first floor to a height at which the hanging mats would give cover to the men who were building the walls up to the 2nd story. They then laid another floor and hoisted the roof up again in the same way. When the time came for another story, they built in the joists, hidden in the exterior walls as before, and again used this flooring to raise the roof platform with its screen of mats. Without any casualties, they built 6 stories in perfect safety, leaving loopholes for artillery fire at what seemed to be the right intervals in the construction. Once they were sure that from this tower they could protect any work going on in its vicinity, they set about constructing a mining gallery, 60 feet long and made of timbers 2 feet square, which was to run from the brick tower to a tower in the city wall. The plan of construction was as follows. First, 2 beams of equal length were laid on the ground 4 feet apart, and into these beams were fixed posts 5 feet high. Rafters were laid across from post to form the framework of a slightly sloping roof. 2-foot beams fastened with iron plates and bolts were fixed on top of the rafters. On the ends of the beams and the edge of the roofing, 3-inch square studs were fitted to support the layers of tiles that were to cover the roof. When the structure of the roof was finished, it was covered over with tiles and mortar to serve as a protection against fire thrown from the walls. Hides were stretched over the tiles so as to prevent them from being dislodged by streams of water that might be directed at them through pipes from above. And the hides themselves were protected by mattresses, so that they too should be kept safe from fire or stones. The whole of this work was completed under cover of screens quite near our tower. Then, quite suddenly, when the enemy were off guard, rollers were put under it, as is done by the Navy to move ships, and the whole structure was moved forward right up against the outer facing of the enemy's tower. This was a sudden blow, and the townspeople were dismayed by it. First they brought up with cranes the heaviest stones that they could find, and rolled them down from the wall onto the gallery. But the timbers were strong enough to stand up to the force of impact, and because the roof was sloped, everything that fell onto it slid off again. Observing this, they adopted another plan. They set fire to barrels of resin and tar, and rolled them down onto the gallery from the wall. These too slipped off the roof, and, once they had fallen down from the tiles, were removed from the building by means of poles and long forks. Meanwhile, the soldiers inside the gallery were levelling out the lowest row of stones in the enemy's tower, the stones by which the foundations were held together. The gallery itself was protected by our men's covering fire from the brick fort. The enemy were pushed back from their walls and strong points. A number of the foundation stones of their tower were pried out, and part of the tower itself suddenly collapsed in ruin. The remaining part was already tilting forward and ready to fall. At this point the enemy, terrified at the thought of their town being sacked, came rushing out of one of the gates in a body, unarmed, with fillets round their heads, and with their hands outstretched like suppliants, appealed for mercy to the officers and men of our forces. This strange sight brought military operations to a standstill. Our soldiers gave up all thought of fighting, and hurried forward to find out and hear what was going on. The enemy, on reaching our lines, all fell down together at the feet of our army and its commanders. They begged them not to take any further action till I had arrived. Their city, they said, was obviously practically in our hands now that our siege works were finished, and their tower on the point of collapse. Nothing could prevent the whole place from being pillaged on my arrival if they failed to obey my commands to the letter. They pointed out that if the tower were to collapse completely, the city might be utterly destroyed, since the soldiers would expect plunder, and it would be impossible to prevent them from breaking in. All these arguments, and others that might be expected from intelligent spokesmen, were accompanied by much weeping and general appeals to pity, which proved very effective. Our officers withdrew the men from the work, and abandoned the siege operations, merely leaving sentries in guard of the various structures. Simply out of compassion, a sort of truce was arranged to operate until I should arrive. Not a shot was fired, either from the walls or from our lines, and it was assumed that everything was over. People generally relaxed, and took things easily. In fact, I had written to Trebonius, making it perfectly clear that I did not want him to allow the town to be taken by storm. I was afraid that the soldiers, who were in a very ugly mood because of the revolt itself, the contemptuous attitude shown to them by the Marsilians, and the continuous hard work that they had been doing, might slaughter everyone in the city of military age. This was what they were threatening to do, and on this occasion it was difficult to prevent them from breaking into the town. They were furious with Trebonius for what appeared to be his refusal to let them occupy the place. The enemy, however, were without a sense of honour. They were merely waiting for a suitable opportunity to show treachery and deceit. They let a few days pass, and then suddenly burst out of their gates at midday, when our men were tired out, or at their ease, some of them having left their posts, and others, after their long days of work, having fallen asleep among the fortifications. All arms had been stacked, and were not available. So the enemy set fire to the siege works, helped in this by a strong wind, which spread the conflagration so far that in a matter of moments the mound, the sheds, the tortoise, a siege tower, and some artillery all caught fire, and were destroyed before anyone realized how it had happened. This sudden disaster roused our men to action. They snatched up whatever weapons they could find. Others came hurrying from the camp, and an attack was made on the enemy, who took to flight. But we were prevented from following them up by the fire of arrows and catapults from the wall. Thus the enemy, safe in the shelter of their wall, were able, without any interference on our part, to set fire to the gallery and to the brick tower. So the labour of several months was destroyed in a mere moment by enemy treachery and by a high wind. Next day the Marsilians tried to repeat their success. They had the advantage of the same wind, and sallied out against the other tower and mound, fighting with greater confidence than before, and doing all they could to set the works on fire. But our men had learned from what had happened on the previous day. They had fallen back from their original state of perfect alertness, but after that they had done everything they could to meet another attack. So the enemy achieved nothing. Many of them were killed, and the rest driven back into the town. Trebonius now set himself to repair the losses, and the men worked more enthusiastically than ever before. They had seen all their labour and all their skill go for nothing. A truce had been wickedly violated, and they were furious at the thought of the Massilians, laughing at their courage and sacrifice. There was no longer any material left for the construction of siege works on the former plan, since every tree in the whole area had already been felled and brought in for use. They therefore started to build a barrier of a kind unheard of before. It was formed of 2 parallel brick walls, each about 6 feet thick, and roofed over with wood, so that the width was about the same as that of the former structure of earth and timber. When the space between the walls seemed too great for the strength of the timber, piles were put in, and cross-beams laid to give additional support. All the roofing was covered with hurdles, and the hurdles were covered with mortar. With this roof overhead, with the walls on their left and right, and with screens in front, the soldiers were able to bring up their building materials in perfect safety. They pushed on fast with the work, and by their skill and energy soon made good all that long labour of theirs that had been wasted. Gates were left in the walls at appropriate places, so that the troops could make sorties if required. The enemy had expected that what they had destroyed would take a long time to repair. They now saw that a few days' hard work had brought things back again into such a state that they could employ neither treachery nor force of arms against us. There was no possibility of harming the troops by artillery, or of setting fire to the siege works. They realized that in just the same way the whole city on the landward side would be completely shut off by towers and fortifications, that they themselves could not properly man their own defences, since our investing walls looked almost as though they were extensions of their walls, being so close that weapons could be thrown across by hand, and that because of this narrow space between the lines, their artillery, in which they had had such faith, was of no use to them at all, while, if they did get a chance of fighting on equal terms with our men from the walls and towers, they would be no match for them in courage and toughness. They therefore reverted to their original proposals for surrender. Settlement of western Spain. Surrender of Marseille. Marcus Varro had been in western Spain from the beginning. When the first news arrived of events in Italy, he had felt doubtful about Pompey's prospects, and was in the habit of referring to me in a most friendly way. His first duty was, he admitted, to Pompey, whose commission he held. Nevertheless, his close friendship with me was, he considered, an equally important tie. He was quite aware of his duties as one appointed by Pompey to a position of trust. He knew, too, what his own strength was, and what was the general feeling in the province with regard to me. This was the way he used to speak on all occasions, and meanwhile he aligned himself definitely with neither side. Later, however, he heard that I was being held up at Marseille, that Patrius and Afranius had joined forces, and their armies had been increased by large numbers of native troops, more of which had been promised and were expected to arrive, and that the whole of eastern Spain was united against me. He heard, too, of what had happened later, of our difficulties with regard to supplies at Lerida. All of this was described to him in somewhat exaggerated terms in a letter from Afranius, and so Varro also began to follow the movements of fortune. He called up men for military service throughout his province. 2 legions were raised, and to these he added about 30 cohorts of auxiliaries. He got together large stocks of grain, partly for Marseille, and partly for Afranius and Petraeus. The people of Cadiz were ordered to build 10 warships, while others were laid down at Seville. All the money and treasure in the Temple of Hercules were removed from the temple into the town of Cadiz, and the town itself was garrisoned by 6 cohorts from the province, sent there by Varro, who put the place in charge of Gaius Gelonius, a Roman gentleman and a close friend of Domitius, who had sent him there to recover some property left to him in a will. Varro himself attacked me in a number of public speeches. He made various official announcements to the effect that I had lost battles, and that great numbers of my soldiers had deserted me and gone over to Afranius. He claimed that he had absolutely reliable authority for making these statements. In this way he made the Roman citizens of western Spain thoroughly frightened, and got them to promise to contribute for his expenses in administration about 18 million sesterces, 15,000 pounds of silver, and 120,000 bushels of wheat. Even heavier burdens were imposed on communities which he thought were on my side. He moved troops into their territories, took proceedings against anyone who had spoken in public or in private against the existing state of affairs, and confiscated their property. He also compelled the whole province to take an oath of allegiance to himself and to Pompey. When he heard of what had happened in eastern Spain, he made ready for war. His plan was to retire to Cadiz with 2 legions, and to keep with him there all his ships and all his supplies of food. He had discovered that the whole province was on my side, and thought that with food and shipping at his disposal, he could easily prolong the war from the island of Cadiz. I had a number of urgent reasons for going back to Italy. Nevertheless, since I knew that Pompey had much influence, and many people bound to him by ties of gratitude in the eastern provinces, I decided not to leave behind me in Spain any vestiges of resistance. I sent 2 legions under the command of the tribune Quintus Cassius to the west of the country, and myself went on ahead, travelling as fast as possible with 600 cavalry. I had a proclamation published in advance, naming the day on which I wished the magistrates and chief men of every community to be at Cordova to meet me. The proclamation reached every part of the province, and every single community sent some of its council to Cordova, nor was there any Roman citizen of importance who failed to put in an appearance on the day that I had named. At the same time, the Roman citizens in Cordova closed the gates of the city against Varro, put sentries on the walls and detachments of troops into the towers, and kept in the town to serve as a garrison 2 cohorts of colonial troops who happened to be passing through. At about the same time, Carmona, which is much the strongest state in the whole province, ejected the 3 cohorts which had been put into the citadel by Varro to serve as a garrison, and closed its gates against them. All this made Varro all the more anxious to get to Cadiz with his legions quickly, in case he might be intercepted on the march or prevented from making the crossing. It had been amply demonstrated to him that the whole province was very much on my side. But before he had gone far, he received a dispatch from Cadiz informing him that as soon as my proclamation had been published there, the leading citizens of the place, together with the officers of the garrison, had made a plan for driving Gelonius out and securing both the town and the island for me. They had next advised Gelonius to leave the city while he could still do so in safety, and told him that if he failed, they would take matters into their own hands. Gelonius had thereupon left. When this news got about, one of Varro's 2 legions, called the Native Legion since it was raised among the provincials, formed up around its standards and marched out of camp, while Varro himself simply stood there and watched. They went to Seville and took up their quarters in the town square and adjoining porticos, doing no damage. The Roman citizens in the town were so pleased at this that they vied with each other in offering hospitality to the troops, inviting them to their own houses. All this had a most disturbing effect on Varro. He changed the direction of his march, and sent on word that he was going to Italica. But he was then told by his friends that Italica had shut its gates against him. He had now nowhere to turn, and sent to me to say that he was prepared to surrender his legion to any officer I might select. I sent Sextus Caesar, and ordered that it should be surrendered to him. After this, Varro came to me at Cordova with a full and accurate statement of public accounts, handed over the funds in his possession, and told me where his stocks of grain were situated, and of the number and whereabouts of his ships. In Cordova I held a public meeting, at which I expressed my thanks to every section of the population. I thanked the Roman citizens for the resolution they had shown me in keeping control of the city, and I thanked the Spaniards for having driven out Varro's garrisons. I thanked the people of Cadiz for having brought the enemy's plans to nothing, and for having made sure of their own freedom. And I thanked the officers and centurions of the garrison for having so courageously supported the resolution of the townspeople. I cancelled the requisitions made by Varro on Roman citizens, and gave back their property to those who had been fined for showing too great freedom of speech. I made certain awards to individuals and to communities, and promised to do still more in the future. After spending 2 days in Cordova, I set out for Cadiz, where I offered that the money and treasure that had been taken from the Temple of Hercules to a private house should be restored to the temple. Here, too, I appointed Cassius governor of western Spain, leaving him with 4 legions. I myself made use of the fleet built by Varro, or by the people of Cadiz on Varro's instructions. On these ships I sailed for Tarragona, and arrived there in a few days' time. I found waiting for me delegations from most of the states of eastern Spain, and then, as at Cordova, I rewarded various cities and individuals. I then set out by land for Narbonne and for Marseille. Here I heard that a law had been passed for the appointment of a dictator, and that I had been nominated for this post by the praetor Marcus Lepidus. The Massilians were now completely exhausted by their sufferings. Their supplies of grain had nearly run out. They had been twice defeated at sea, and constantly routed on land whenever they attempted to break out. They were suffering from sickness in a very severe form, the result of the long siege and the consequent change in their diet, for they were now all reduced to eating stale millet and rotten barley, which had long ago been stored in the public warehouses for such an emergency as this. One of their towers and a considerable section of their wall had collapsed, and they had no hope of relief or reinforcements from other armies or from other provinces, since these, they discovered, had now come under my control. So they decided to surrender unconditionally. A few days earlier, Domitius got news of what they intended to do. He secured 3 ships, 2 of which he gave to his friends and personal followers, and went aboard the 3rd one himself. They set sail when the weather was stormy, but were observed by some of Brutus's ships, which were, as they were ordered to do daily, watching the exits of the harbour. They weighed anchor and gave chase. The ship, which was carrying Domitius himself, held on its course, and, with the help of a strong wind, sailed away out of sight. The other 2, alarmed by the intervention of our ships, took shelter in the harbour. In accordance with my orders, the Massilians brought out from the town all their arms and artillery, handed over their ships from the harbour and the dockyards, and gave up all the money in their treasury. When this was done, I spared the town itself, not because the inhabitants had deserved such treatment from me, but because of the antiquity of the place and its past glories. I left 2 legions in the city as a garrison, and sent the rest to Italy. I myself set out for Rome. Curio's campaign in Africa. During the same period as that of the above events, Curio had set out from Sicily to Africa. From the very beginning he thought very little of the troops under Publius Attius Varus, and took with him only 2 of the 4 legions which I had left him, and 500 cavalry. He spent 2 days and 3 nights on the voyage, and then landed at a place called Anquillaria, which is about 20 miles from Calibia. It has headlands on both sides, and provides fairly good anchorage in summer. At Kabylia, young Lucius Caesar was waiting to oppose him with a fleet of 10 ships which had been laid up at Utica ever since the Pirate War, and had been refitted for the present war on the orders of Publius Attius. Lucius was terrified at the size of Curio's fleet, and immediately made for the land. He ran his own decked trireme ashore at the nearest beach, and, abandoning her there, fled overland to Hadrumetum, which was held by Gaius Considius Longus, with 1 legion. The rest of his ships also came to Hadrumetum after the flight of their commander. He had been pursued by Curio's officer, Marcius Rufus, with 12 ships that had been brought from Sicily to escort the transports, and after seeing the trireme abandoned on the shore, Rufus had towed it away before rejoining Curio with his fleet. Curio then instructed him to sail on ahead to Utica, while he himself marched there with the army. After a march of 2 days, Curio reached the river Bagrada. Here he left Caninius Rebilus in command of the legions, and taking the cavalry with him went forward to reconnoitre Castra Cornelia, as this was supposed to be an excellent position for a camp. It is a straight ridge projecting into the sea, steep and rugged on both sides, but with a rather gentler slope on the side that faces Utica. It is about 3 miles away from Utica by the direct route, but this way there is a lot of marshy ground, because a stream rises near the road, and the sea flows inland along its bed for some distance. To avoid the marsh, one has to make a detour of 6 miles to reach the town. In the course of this reconnaissance, Curio was able to get a view of Varus's camp, the fortifications of which were connected with the town wall near the so-called Gate of Baal. It was in an extremely strong position, protected on one side by the town itself and on the other by the theatre outside the town walls. There was a lot of building above and below ground near this theatre, which made the approaches to the camp narrow and difficult. Curio noticed at the same time that all the roads were crowded with convoys of property and livestock being brought into the town from the country, owing to the fear of a sudden outbreak of violence. So he sent out his cavalry to bring in what they could get as plunder, and at the same time, in order to protect all this property, Varus sent out of the town 600 Numidian horsemen and 400 infantry. These reinforcements had been sent to Varus at Utica a few days previously by King Juba, whose father had been a friend of Pompey's, and who had personal reasons for disliking Curio. As tribune, Curio had proposed that a law should be passed for annexing Juba's territory to that of Rome. The cavalry on both sides engaged, and the Numidians failed to stand up to the first charge. After about 120 of them had been killed, the rest fell back toward the town and their camp. Meanwhile, his warships having appeared, Curio had a proclamation made to the 200 or so merchant vessels lying in Utica harbour that he would treat as enemies all who did not transfer their ships to Castra Cornelia. The proclamation had an immediate effect. They all weighed anchor, left Utica, and sailed where they were told to go. As a result, our army got ample supplies of everything. After these successes, Curio returned to his camp at the Bagrada, where the whole army saluted him as Imperator. Next day he led them to Utica and camped not far from the town. Before the construction of the camp was finished, cavalry outposts rode in with the news that large reinforcements of infantry and cavalry, sent by King Juba, were approaching Utica. At the same time, a great cloud of dust appeared in the distance, and very soon the vanguard came into sight. Curio was alarmed by this new turn of affairs, and sent out his cavalry to bear the brunt of the first enemy attack and hold it off. Meanwhile, he quickly recalled the legions from their work and drew them up in battle order. The cavalry went into action, and, before the legions could take up position, routed the entire Numidian army, who were soon thrown into confusion, handicapped as they were by their baggage, and marching in no sort of order, and under no apprehension of being attacked. Nearly all their cavalry escaped, since they managed to get quickly into the town along the coast, but their infantry suffered heavy losses. On the next night, 2 Marsian centurions, with 22 of their men, deserted and went over to Attius Varus. They told him that the whole of Curio's army was disaffected and advised him most strongly to come forward and show himself so as to provide an opportunity for reaching a settlement. Whether they genuinely held this opinion or merely wished to tell Varus what he would like to hear is uncertain. Certainly we are prone to believing what we want to, and rather hope that others feel what we feel ourselves. In any case, Varus was influenced by their views. Early next day he led his legions out of camp. Curio did the same thing, and the 2 forces were drawn up opposite each other, with only a small valley between them. In Varus's army was Sextus Quintilius Varus, who, as was mentioned earlier, had been at Corfinium. After I had given him his freedom, he had crossed over to Africa. Curio now had brought across the legions whose surrender I had accepted earlier at Corfinium. Some centurions had been changed, but otherwise the officers and men were the same. Quintilius, therefore, was in a good position for making an appeal to Curio's troops, and he began to go up and down the line, begging them to remember how in the old days they had sworn an oath of loyalty to Domitius, and to him too, as Domitius's quaestor. He besought them not to be at war with their own comrades, who had had the same experiences and known the same sufferings as they had at the siege of Corfinium, and not to fight for people who looked down on them and called them deserters. He went on to suggest that they could expect an appropriate reward, and would find that he was ready to provide them with it, if they came over to his side and joined forces with Varus. This speech of his provoked no reaction in Curio's army, and each commander led his troops back to camp. In Curio's camp, however, everyone was becoming exceedingly anxious, and the more people discussed the situation among themselves, the more the anxiety grew. Everyone had his own version of things, and made his own contribution to the general disquiet. Soon a fabrication of one man, through being repeated from one to another, appeared to be a fact known to many. In view of this state of alarm, Curio called a council of war to discuss the whole position. Some were of the opinion that action was absolutely necessary, and that an attack should be made on Varus's camp. With the soldiers in their present mood, the greatest danger, they considered, was in action. And in any case it was better bravely to try the fortune of war in battle than to suffer the final penalty after being deserted and betrayed by their own men. Others were in favor of leaving their present position at midnight and retiring to Castra Cornelia. In this way, it was suggested, time would be gained in which the men might come to their senses, and also, if matters got worse, it would be easier, with all the ships available there, to withdraw quite safely to Sicily. Curio was against both plans, against the first as being too rash, and against the second as being too cowardly. One proposal he considered was for running away in dishonour, and the other was for fighting, even when the conditions were unfavourable. "How can we possibly feel confident," he said, "that we can storm a camp that is so well placed and has been so well fortified? And what shall we have gained if, after suffering heavy losses, we give up the attempt? As though it were not perfectly well known that what gives a general the goodwill of his troops is success, and what arouses their hatred is failure. On the other hand, to change the position of our camp would look like a shameful avoidance of action. It would imply that we despaired of the whole situation, and would cost us the confidence of the men. Good soldiers ought not to suspect that they are not being trusted, and bad soldiers ought not to know that they are causing anxiety. If they do, the good will become disheartened, and the bad will be even less amenable to discipline than before. I myself am perfectly sure that these reports about disaffection in the army are either entirely false or greatly exaggerated. But even if we were convinced that they were true, it would be much better for us to pretend that we knew nothing about them than to corroborate them by our own behavior. Surely we ought to disguise the defects there may be in our army, just as we bandage up our wounds so as not to give encouragement to the enemy. And as for the additional proposal that we should set out at midnight, this, so far as I can see, would merely give greater opportunities for indiscipline to those who want to profit from them. The chief safeguards of good discipline are a sense of honor and fear, neither of which operate well by night. For these reasons, I myself am neither bold enough to propose attacking their camp when we have no chance of success, nor am I cowardly enough to give up hope altogether. Before doing this, we should, I think, try every possible course open to us, and I feel fairly certain that you and I together will be able to reach a decision on this point. After the council of war, Curio addressed a general meeting of the troops. He reminded them of how they had felt toward me at Corfinium, and of how it was, owing to their goodwill and their example, that I had been able to win over so much of Italy. You were the leaders, he told them, and it was your example that was followed by town after town. Caesar naturally felt particularly warm toward you, just as his enemies particularly disapproved of you. For it was your action which set the standard for others, and which resulted in Pompey's being forced to leave Italy, though he was still undefeated in battle. And it was to you that Caesar entrusted me, his dearest friend, together with the province of Sicily and Africa, the two areas which he must hold if he is to hold Rome and Italy. Yet there are some people who are capable of trying to make you desert us. Indeed, what more could they want than, at one and the same time, to ruin us and to make you into criminals? We admit that we owe everything to you. They believe that it is because of you that they have lost everything. How could they better satisfy their hatred of you than by persuading you to betray us, and then put yourselves into their hands? Have you not heard of what Caesar has done in Spain? 2 armies defeated, 2 generals crushed, 2 provinces won back, and all this within 40 days of his appearance in front of the enemy. They certainly could not stand up to him when they were at full strength. Will they do any better now that they are practically finished? And you followed Caesar when victory was still uncertain. Now the issue has been decided, and are you now going to go over to the losing side just when the time has come for you to receive the rewards of your loyalty? They claim that they have been deserted and betrayed by you, and they talk about the oath which you once swore. But was it you who deserted Domitius, or Domitius who deserted you? Was it not the fact that while you were ready to do your duty to the end, he abandoned you? Did he not try to run away to safety without your knowledge? Is it not true that after he had deserted you, Caesar came to your help and saved you? How can Domitius think that you are bound to him by an oath when he himself gave up the emblems of authority, laid down his command, and with no higher status than an ordinary civilian, came as a prisoner into Caesar's power? An odd sort of a sense of honor this is, to break the oath by which you are now bound, and go back to those obligations which you used to have before they were cancelled by the surrender of your general and the loss of his authority. It may be, of course, that while you are willing to support Caesar, you feel doubtful about me. Well, I am not going to make a speech about what I have done for you. So far, it is less than I should like, and perhaps less than you expected. However, soldiers always wait for their rewards until the campaign is over, and even you must be sure of what the final result of this campaign will be. I can claim, I think, to have shown efficiency and to have enjoyed good luck up to the present time. You will not object to the fact that I brought the army across the sea without losing a single ship, that as soon as I arrived I attacked and dispersed the enemy's fleet, that I defeated their cavalry twice in 2 days, and that I brought over to us 200 fully loaded ships, right out of the enemy's harbour, thus making it impossible for them to get supplies either by sea or by land. Are you going to turn your backs on this leadership and this good luck? Do you prefer the idea of the disgrace at Corfinium, the overrunning of Italy, the surrender of the 2 Spanish provinces, all of which indicate how the war in Africa will turn out? As for me, I merely wanted to be known as one of Caesar's soldiers. You honored me with the title Imperator. If you regret having done so, you are free to take your gift back again. Give me the name I used to bear, so that it will not look as though you honored me only to insult me." The soldiers were much moved by this speech. They kept on interrupting Curio while he was speaking, and made it clear that they were greatly upset at having their loyalty questioned. And when he left the meeting they came thronging round him, telling him to have no doubts at all, and urging him not to hesitate about providing how loyal and how brave they would show themselves in battle. It was a complete change in the general attitude and feeling of the men, and Curio, with the consent of all his officers, decided to give battle as soon as he had a chance of doing so. Next day he led his troops out and drew them up in order of battle in the same position as before. Varus took up the challenge and led his own troops out, wishing to take whatever chance was given him, either to tamper with the loyalty of Curio's men, or to fight them in a favorable position. As already explained, there was a valley between the two lines. It was not particularly large, but had steep sides that were difficult to climb. Each commander was waiting to see whether his opponent would attempt to cross the valley, and so give him the advantage of position. On the left, however, the whole of Varus's cavalry, with a number of light troops, were seen going down into the valley. Curio sent out against them his own cavalry and 2 cohorts of Marrucini. The enemy cavalry failed to stand up to the first charge, and galloped back to their own lines, leaving behind them the light troops who had accompanied them, and who were now surrounded and cut to pieces by our men. This took place in full view of Varus's army, who could see their own people running away and being cut down. With Curio was Rebilus, a senior officer of mine, whom Curio had brought with him from Sicily, knowing what an experienced soldier he was. Rebilus now said, "You can see the state the enemy are in, Curio. Now is your chance. Take it." And Curio, merely shouting out to the soldiers that they must now remember their promises of yesterday, charged forward ahead of them, telling them to follow. The valley was so steep that the first men to get across could only climb up with the help of those behind them. But Varus's troops were aware of nothing but the panic and flight and slaughter of their own men. They imagined that they were already being surrounded by cavalry, and never even thought of putting up a resistance. So, before the first weapon was thrown, or our men could get at all close to them, the whole of Varus's line turned about and fled to their camp. Ahead of Curio's men in the pursuit of the defeated enemy was an ordinary private soldier, a Pelignian, Fabius by name. He kept on shouting out, "Varus, Varus," so that he gave the impression of being one of Varus's own men who wished to give him some information or convey some warning. Varus himself, hearing his name called out so often, stopped, looked around, and asked the man who he was and what he wanted, whereupon Fabius struck out with his sword at his unprotected shoulder, and very nearly killed him. Varus just raised his shield in time to ward off the blow. Fabius was then surrounded by the nearest soldiers and killed. Now the confused mass of fugitives poured into the gates, and got so jammed that they were scarcely able to move. More of them died here in the press than had died in battle or during the pursuit. They were very nearly driven out of their camp altogether, and some of them, in fact, ran on without stopping until they got to the town. But Curio's advance was held up by the natural strength of the position and by the fortifications. Also, his troops had come out equipped for battle, not for making an assault on a camp. So Curio led his troops back to his own camp. Apart from Fabius, he had suffered no casualties, while on the enemy side about 600 were killed and 1,000 wounded. All these wounded and a great many others who pretended to be injured made their way in terror from the camp to the town as soon as Curio had withdrawn. When Varus became aware of this, and realized in what a state of panic his army was, He left in his camp a trumpeter and a few tents for appearance's sake, and shortly after midnight quietly withdrew the rest of his army into Utica. Next day Curio began to blockade the place by building an earthwork all around it. The people in the town had long enjoyed peace and were quite unused to war. The native inhabitants were very much on my side because of various kindnesses I had done to them. The Roman community consisted of people of all classes, and as the result of previous battles there was a general state of panic. They were all talking quite openly of surrender, and Varus was being urged not to ruin everyone by insisting on holding out. But just at this moment messengers from King Juba arrived to say that he himself with large forces was approaching the city, and to urge him to guard and defend it until he came. This news dispelled their fear and put fresh heart into them. Curio received the same report, but for some time he refused to believe it, so confident was he that everything was going his own way. By now messengers and dispatches had come to Africa with news of my successes in Spain. With all this to encourage him, Curio felt sure that the king would not venture to attack him. But on receiving definite information that Juba's army was about 24 miles from Utica, he abandoned his blockade and retired to Castra Cornelia. Here he began to bring in stocks of grain and timber and to build a fortified camp. At the same time he sent to Sicily for the 2 other legions and the rest of his cavalry. His position at Castra Cornelia was an extremely good one for fighting a long campaign. The situation itself was strong, and it was well fortified. It was near the sea, it had a good water supply, and there was also a good store of salt there, which had been collected from the salt works nearby. There were forests in the neighborhood, and also large tracts of cultivated land, so that there could be no shortage either of timber or of grain. Curio, therefore, with the unanimous agreement of his staff, decided to hold out here, while waiting for his reinforcements. But after these arrangements had been made and approved of, more news came in from some deserters from Utica. According to them, some quarrel leading to hostilities had broken out between King Juba and the people of Leptis. Juba had therefore gone back and had stayed behind in his kingdom, while an officer of his, Sabura by name, with only quite small forces, had been sent on and was now approaching Utica. Curio unwisely believed this information to be true, altered his whole plan, and decided on fighting a pitched battle. He was a young man. He had a great spirit. Things had gone well so far, and he felt confident of the future. All this spurred him on to action and affected the decision which he took. As soon as it was dark, he sent his whole cavalry force against the enemy's camp on the river Bagrada. Sabura, of whom he had already been informed, was in command of this camp. But King Juba was following behind in full force, and had halted about 6 miles away from Sabura's position. Curio's cavalry reached the enemy under cover of night, and attacked them when they were completely off their guard. In fact, the Numidians, following some native custom of their own, were scattered about in all directions, and in no sort of order. Finding them dispersed in this way, and overcome with sleep, Curio's men rode down on them and killed a great number, while the rest fled in terror. After the action, the cavalry returned to Curio, bringing some prisoners with them. Curio himself had started marching at about 3 in the morning, leaving 5 cohorts behind to guard the camp. After going about 6 miles, he met the cavalry and was told of their successful action. He asked the prisoners who commanded the camp at the Bagrada, and they replied, Sabura. Curio, in his eagerness to press forward, made no more inquiries. He turned to the soldiers standing by the nearest standard and said, "There you are. The prisoners confirm what the deserters told us. The king is not here. He has only sent a small force which has proved too weak even for a few of our cavalry. Let us go ahead then. Plunder and glory are in front of us. Now is the time for us to start thinking of our gratitude to you and of how we can repay it." The cavalry had in fact done very well, particularly when one considers their small numbers in comparison with the great force of Numidians. Nevertheless, the men had somewhat exaggerated their own achievements, not unnaturally, since people enjoy dwelling on their own merits. There was also a lot of plunder to show. Captured men and horses were brought forward, so that the general impression was that any delay that might take place was merely postponing a certain victory. Thus, Curio's confidence was matched by the enthusiasm of his troops. Ordering the cavalry to follow, he marched on as fast as possible so as to attack the enemy while they were still suffering from the effects of their recent defeat. The men, however, were tired out after a night's marching, and could not keep up with him. Various detachments were constantly falling out to rest. Even this had no effect on Curio's self-confidence. Juba was informed by Sabura of the night battle, and sent to his relief 2,000 Spanish and Gallic cavalry, troops which he kept as a rule for his personal bodyguard, and the best regiments of his infantry. He himself followed slowly after with the rest of his forces, and with 60 elephants. Sabura had guessed that Curio himself was approaching under cover of the cavalry, which he had sent ahead. He drew up his whole army, infantry and cavalry, and instructed them to fall back gradually, as though they were retreating in fear. He himself, when the right moment came, would give them the signal for joining battle, and any other instructions that might be required by the situation. Curio had been confident enough already. What was happening now seemed to justify him in his view, and under the impression that the enemy were in flight, he led down his troops from the higher ground into the plain. So he marched, on and on. After covering a distance of 11 miles, he halted to rest his tired army. Sabura now gave the signal to his men, drew up his line, and went around the ranks encouraging the troops. He kept his infantry back, using it only for show. It was the cavalry that went into action against the Roman line. Curio behaved well in the emergency. He called on his men to fight, and told them that everything depended on the courage they showed. Nor was there any lack of courage or willingness to fight shown either by the infantry, in spite of their fatigue, or by the cavalry, in spite of the fact that they were few in number and already tired out. There were only about 200 of them, the rest having dropped out on the march, and wherever they charged, they forced the enemy to fall back. But they could not pursue for any distance, and could not drive their horses too hard. The enemy cavalry were able to get around both our flanks and to ride into the men from the rear. Whenever any of our cohorts charged out from the main body, the Numidians were fast and fresh enough to avoid the attack, and then, after regrouping, came back again to surround our men and cut them off from the line. It seemed equally dangerous to preserve proper formation in the ranks, or to charge out and engage the enemy. Meanwhile, the enemy forces were constantly increasing as more and more men were sent up by Juba. Our men's strength began to fail as they grew more tired, and the wounded could neither leave the line nor be carried into safety, since the whole army was entirely surrounded by the enemy cavalry. They gave up all hope, and as men do when their last moments have come, wept at the prospect of their own death, or commended their parents to the care of any who might be lucky enough to escape. There were terror and grief on every side. Curio saw that terror had spread throughout his army, and realized that no words of encouragement, no prayers of his would find a hearing. In so desperate a situation, he saw only one hope left, and ordered the standards to be moved in the direction of the nearest hills, and for the whole army to follow and occupy the position. Sabura, however, had anticipated him, and sent his cavalry ahead to forestall him. Our men were now in complete despair, and some were cut down by the enemy cavalry as they tried to run away. Others just fell to the ground and lay there. Gnaeus Domitius, who was in command of our cavalry, rode up to Curio with a few horsemen and urged him to run for it and try to get back to the camp, promising to stay with him all the way there. But Curio replied, "I have lost the army which Caesar entrusted to me. I can never look him in the face again." So he died fighting. Very few of his cavalry survived the battle. Those who, as already mentioned, had halted at the rear of the column to rest their horses, saw from a distance the rout of the whole army, and themselves got back safely to camp. The soldiers in the legions were killed to a man. The quaestor, Marcius Rufus, had been left in charge of the camp by Curio. When he heard the news of the disaster, he did what he could to keep up his men's spirits, but they begged and implored him to be sent back by sea to Sicily. He promised to do this, and ordered all captains of ships to have their boats brought close inshore in the early evening. However, a state of complete panic prevailed. Some said that Juba's army was approaching, others that Varus and his legions were marching out, and that they could already see the dust raised by his advancing column, though nothing of the kind had taken place at all, and others imagined that they would shortly be attacked by the enemy fleet. In the general confusion, each man thought only of himself. Those who were aboard the warships wanted to get away at once, and their eagerness to be gone made the captains of the transports want to sail too. A very few small boats obeyed instructions and appeared as ordered, but on the crowded beaches men struggled over who should embark first, and some of these small craft sank from the weight of those who were trying to get aboard, with the result that the other boats hesitated to come in close for fear of suffering the same fate. So it happened that only a few soldiers and family men who could arouse compassion or use influence, or were able to swim out to the ships, were taken aboard and reached Sicily in safety. The rest of the army sent a delegation of centurions to Varus in the night and surrendered. Next day Juba saw the men of these cohorts outside the town, and claimed them as his own booty. He ordered some to be killed, and picked out a few others to be sent back to his kingdom. Varus objected, saying that his own word of honor was being broken, but he did not dare to take any action. Juba himself rode into Utica, escorted by several senators, among whom were Servius Sulpicius and Licinius Damasippus. After giving brief instructions as to what he wanted to be done in the city, he withdrew in a few days to his own kingdom with all his forces.